My name is Margaret Weir. I am a professor here at the Watson Institute at Brown University. And I want to welcome everyone to the James and Catherine Stone Initiative on Inequality, final session for the spring semester. I'm pleased today to welcome Dan Hirschman. Dan is currently an assistant professor of sociology here at Brown and soon to be assistant professor of sociology at Cornell. Dan's research examines the role of numbers in political and economic life. He studied debates around affirmative action and the quantification of merit in undergraduate admissions, political contestation around gender-based pricing of insurance and credit, and many other debates around the quantification of life. He's currently working on a book manuscript on the production and circulation of quantitative descriptions of inequality, tentatively titled Unequal Knowledge, the Stylized Facts of Inequality. His talk today draws from that research. So welcome, Dan.
Thank you so much. It's an absolute pleasure to have a chance to talk about this work with all of you. I'm going to give you kind of a brief overview of the book as a whole and focus in on kind of the theoretical setup, and then just sort of hint at each of the case chapters. I'm happy to talk about any more of those in detail if you'd like. And I'll just say that I'm at a sort of an interesting point with the book, which is that I'm trying to figure out how to frame the sort of front-end introduction of the book now that all the cases are kind of settled. So I'd love to hear your thoughts about that, and in particular, how I can make the book sort of more relevant to folks who come to it not interested, as I did, primarily in like the politics expertise and economists and numbers, but interested more in kind of like the history of inequality and the substance of the cases. So my goal for the next couple months is to figure out how to articulate those things together better. So the talk is titled The Stylized Facts of Inequality, and that's what I'm going to be talking about today. To give you a sense of the kind of thing I have in mind, let me show you a graph that showed up in today's inbox. If you subscribe to certain New York Times newsletters, you might have seen this chart about growth in the share of the wealth of the top 0.0001% of households. This is basically your billionaire class and how their wealth has skyrocketed. It's probably actually an underestimate because it went up even more during the pandemic. From owning just 0.1% of all wealth that's measured to owning more than 1.2%. Think your Elon Musk buying Twitter events. I'm interested in the emergence of and circulation of numbers like this. That is, fairly simple quantitative descriptions of aspects of inequality that are connected to broader public debates, political contestation, regulation decisions, and so on, as well as the kind of research programs that academics produce that make possible the sort of production of data like this, then also its interpretation and analysis. That's where I'm kind of coming from. And so broadly, I'm interested in how we talk about inequality and how this has changed over time. And I'm especially interested in the role of, as Margaret pointed out, quantitative description, which is a topic I think that's super important, but one that gets relatively little attention as compared to other kinds of social scientific claims. And so the broad kind of theme of the book is about the relationship between inequality knowledge and inequality politics, how those three things are intertwined to the extent that they are. To preview the argument, what I'm going to do is try to introduce a term to you to kind of theorize a term that's already in widespread use, and that's the term stylized fact. I'm going to argue that this term, which is already sort of used by a lot of economists and some other quantitative social scientists, is a nice way to describe a certain class of quantitative descriptions that do a lot of work in the social sciences. In particular, they can kind of stand in for phenomena. That is, they become the kind of thing that social scientists are trying to explain. At the same time, those stylized facts travel. They travel out into policy and public discourse, reshaping how we think about what kinds of inequality are important or what the trends in those measures have been. The three cases I look at, which again, I'm just going to preview briefly each one at the end, are the rise of discourses around the 1%, so top income earners in the 2000s, and how that connects to our understanding of the sort of knowledge infrastructures used to measure and track inequality. And in particular, to answer the question of sort of why we started talking about the 1% only in the 2000s, even though those top incomes started rising in the 80s and 90s. The second chapter looks at the gender wage gap, and in particular, how debates over the gender wage gap are informed by what other scholars have called folk economics, that is kind of everyday understandings of how the economy works, which in turn lead to sort of consistent misinterpretation of the gender wage gap as meaning something that it does not, and sort of the problems of that description is faced as it enters the public sphere. And then the last chapter looks at the racial wealth gap, which is also another relatively new number that people have drawn attention to, and focused on the work of a handful of actors, mostly sociologists and economists, who have worked really hard to push the racial wealth gap as an alternative narrative to, say, income inequality, as a way to reopen politics around things like reparations or baby bonds, sort of more radical reforms aimed at structural racism, which they believe can be sort of motivated around the racial wealth gap in ways they couldn't have been around income inequality. So those are the cases. Today, I'm supposed to mostly spend time talking about the sort of theoretical framing. And so the rest of the outline of the talk, I'm going to briefly describe how I think about the interaction of experts in politics. And then I'm going to just sort of define stylized facts, talk about their history. And then I'm going to give that a little more of the preview of those cases, depending on how much time people have and interest they have in those, before basically not concluding. Because one of the things I really like to get from today's conversation or be help with is sort of thinking about how to broaden out and make connections that are more useful to folks in different conversations. And so the broad question that I brought to this debate is this question around how social scientists influence public policy and public discourse. That is, what is the role of social science in shaping how people think about social problems, making policy about it? And in particular, I brought to it a sense that scholars of this question, people who focused on ideas and the role of ideas, hadn't paid enough attention yet to the importance of descriptive social scientific claims. What do I mean by that? When I think about what social scientists do all day, you can kind of break apart the claims they make into different clusters. Because I'm a sociologist, I'm going to make a 2x2 table. And so on the one hand, we have social scientific claims that are descriptive. And on the other hand, we have social scientific claims that are more intendedly causal. On the other axis, we can think about claims that are narrower or broader in terms of sort of the scope that they cover. And this is a heuristic device, obviously lots of stuff that's in the messy middle. On the kind of narrow descriptive side, we can think of kind of claims coming out of traditional ethnographic kinds of work of sort of thick description, describing a particular site in sort of in messy detail, without necessarily intentions of generalizability. On the narrow causal side, we could think about experimental manipulations, the rise of randomized controlled trials, and other approaches that attempt to isolate like kind of particular outcomes associated with a particular intervention. And these, of course, have become very important in policymaking circles, both in development contexts and in places like the US and things like anti-poverty policy and so on. On the broad and causal, we could think of kind of what you might call big theory, your big paradigms. A lot of the classic work in this tradition looked at, say, the rise and fall of Keynesianism, the rise and fall of monetarism, these kinds of larger paradigms that shaped whole approaches to governance. What I think is missing, though, in the conversation about the role of social scientists and their influence on policymaking is this kind of broad descriptive zone. That is to say, claims that social scientists make that are intended to cover a wide swath of time and space, which do so in a way that's intendedly descriptive rather than causal. What I want to argue is that those claims are both important to how the social sciences operate, but also in terms of kind of how they influence broader conversations outside of academia. So by a stylized fact, what I mean, or I'm going to define it as, is an empirical regularity in need of an explanation. That is, it's some aspect of social life that is seen as recurrent enough to be kind of stable enough you can hold on to it, and which is not yet currently explained, but is seen as important enough to be worth explaining. And again, this is me trying to define a term that's already in use, but one that's been used in a relatively unreflective way. I'll talk about that in a second. A few examples and sort of classes of these things might be helpful to give you sense of what I'm talking about. On the one hand, I think about stylized facts in terms of sort of broad groupings. So one group are things like correlations. So A correlates with B. Here we can think about a claim like the empirical claim, democracies rarely go to war with each other, which is sort of the foundational claim of the democratic peace tradition in political science. And that sort of foundational empirical claim then sparks a bunch of theorizing. We can think of trends, like the claim from economic sociologists like Brenner Krippner that the share of profits going to finance has risen dramatically over the last 40 years, financialization. And last, we can think about rates, which you can also think of as a non-trend with time, as something that's sort of stable across time, like the claim coming out of an interesting historical misreading of Kinsey's work that 1 in 10 people are gay. Each of these claims is intended to be sort of a statement about something that is regular enough and enduring enough to be interesting and also sort of important enough on its own that it's worth explaining. So as a reminder, these are explicitly not causal claims. They're about sort of how things are related, but not necessarily why. And also they have a normative aspect. They have several normative aspects, but one big normative aspect is they're kind of a demand on researcher attention. That is, they're a claim that this is something worth paying attention to. Last, And this is not just unique to stylized facts, it's true of a lot of claims that social scientists makes. We do a lot of our theorizing with language we don't have complete control over. That is to say, we talk in terms that everyone else talks in also. So terms like democracy or war or profit or gay are all terms that have a specific technical meaning in particular data sets. They also have a broader public meaning that may or may not align well with that particular technical meaning. So when certain political scientists say war, they mean an armed conflict with a certain number of deaths in a certain period of time, say. That may or may not match what the average person on the street or the average policymaker thinks a war is. And the same for something like gay, where you actually get some tension around how you read different sexual histories and whether you read onto them a certain kind of permanence or identity, et cetera. Again, not unique to stylized fact, but a key feature of them, and particularly important because it's part of how they're able to travel, I think, so seamlessly out of academia into everyday usage, with people thinking they know what they mean, sometimes correctly, sometimes not. As I said, this term has been in use for a while. In particular, it starts in economics in the 1950s, where economists identify a set of sort of roughly constant trends in macroeconomics, and they then become the kinds of things that economists model. Most famously, the Kaldor facts, which were sort of 6 facts that Nicholas Kaldor identified in the 1950s, the most famous of which is the idea that labor's share of national income is roughly constant over long periods of time. And this stable set of relationships were seen as the things that economic models needed to explain. That particular one is also, of course, claimed by inequality. And what's interesting because it sort of breaks down in the 1990s, and economists noticed that and paid a lot of attention to it precisely because it was something they had assumed to be stable for a long period of time. The term picks up in usage in the 60s through 80s in economics, starts to spread out to other disciplines in the 90s, and then starting in the 2000s really spreads widely to the other quantitative social sciences like sociology and political science, particularly the parts that are connected closely to economics. Here's just a simple chart showing how many times the phrase appears in JSTOR, and by the end of this period, about more than 1% of all economics articles use the term. But I want to overemphasize the term itself because I think this concept is actually broader than that. Lots of folks in the social sciences are working with stylized facts, even though they don't use the term explicitly. And this is true both in contemporary discussions, but also going way, way back. So for example, if you go back all the way to Max Weber's Protestant Ethic and the opening pages of that sort of hallowed text, you see Weber opening his discussion with a stylized fact claim about the relationship between Protestants and capitalism. Weber writes, a glance at the occupational statistics of any country of mixed religious composition brings slight remarkable frequency the fact that business leaders and owners of capital are overwhelmingly Protestant, right? Here we have an association held over time and place between religion and sort of being a capitalist. And obviously Weber's book is not specifically an investigation of this empirical claim. He's not trying to unpack exactly why this is the case in terms of like some kind of quantitative model, say like the way an economist would, but it has the same kind of motivating feature. We're going to open with this kind of broad quantitative observation and then provide some kind of story about that helps make sense of it. And so broadening out, I think what stylized facts do in academic conversations is they take the place for phenomena. Phenomena is a term that philosophers of science like Ian Hacking use to describe this kind of stable features of the world where if you push it a certain way, it pushes back the same way. And once you identify those phenomena, you can then study them and model them. Think like the photoelectric effect. We social scientists mostly don't have phenomena. We mostly don't have a stable enough world that we can push on it and always push it back the same way. But our world also isn't complete chaos. Lots of things are relatively stable over periods of time. And so stylized facts are one way to kind of bound those things and figure out which of them are the most important. And so they become the kinds of things we explain with various models, either formal models in economics or rational choice theory versions of political science or sociology, or less formal approaches like Weber's more narrative approaches. Another thing that stylized facts do, and this is sort of part of their original purpose in Kaldor's naming them, is kind of emphasize signal and noisy data. Yes, labor's share of national income goes up or down a few points here and there, but it was roughly, say, 73% for a long time, plus or minus a few percentage points. And what's really interesting, if you're Kaldor in 1957, is not that it goes up or down a little bit here or there, but that it's basically constant for decades. And so that's the kind of claim that it is. But if that were all stylized facts did, they'd be kind of interesting to, say, sociologists of social science. But I think they also have this characteristic of being prone to travel. And so what I mean by that is that these stylized facts claims frequently travel outside of academia and meet up with other kinds of conversations, other kinds of claims making by social movements, by political parties, and so on, often armed with what you might call folk causal theories. That is to say, the stylized fact claim is an empirical claim about irregularity. It doesn't have a causal claim attached to it. Folks bring their own causal ideas, which may or may not be informed by the same ideas that academics are working with. So you may think you know why gender wage gap exists, it has to do with discrimination, and you read that onto the number. They also can sort of shape social identities. Numbers are productive of lots of things. One thing they can be productive of is, in fact, identity claims. My partner, Jamie Budnick, worked in the history of the measurement of the LGBTQ population. And one of the things that the sort of scholars in that tradition show is how the sort of reading of Kinsey's work around 1 in 10 people being gay was sort of used in social movements. They sort of claimed a certain status. They drew on that number to make claims about the sort of prevalence of gay people to make civil rights claims. Similarly, with Occupy Wall Street, we saw the emergence of the 99%, right? They had protest signs that literally had charts of inequality data and signs saying we are the 99%, right? So here's a way in which a particular framing of inequality sort of helps produce certain kinds of new social identities. And lastly, these stylized facts can thus link those two conversations together and serve as kind of boundary objects through which different groups can coordinate and communicate, connecting a kind of research debate and the political debates, albeit imperfectly. So that's kind of what I think these things are doing and why I think they're worth studying. A few caveats: not everything is a stylized fact. So for example, a specific data point not claimed as irregularity is not a stylized fact. For example, if you say the US unemployment rate is 4.6% this month, you're not making a claim that it typically is that much or always is that much or is that way for a long period of time. That would not be a stylized fact claim. In contrast, a claim you get from economics that the unemployment rate for white Americans is typically about half that of Black Americans, which is a sort of stylized fact claim that is basically true and is something that people study, that would be the kind of regularity that would count as a stylized fact. Additionally, of course, if you're claiming kind of causal, not just associational regularity, that's also not a stylized fact. Again, not because those things are important for politics, just then trying to delimit the scope of what I'm studying. Finally, you can make a claim that something is a stylized fact and not have that claim succeed. So for example, you can claim that something's a regularity and someone can push back and say, no, it's not. Occasionally you'll hear economists use the phrase that something was more stylized than fact, by which they mean the thing you identified and thought was a regularity, in fact, is not. It's just an artifact or a happenstance or a one-off. Similarly, you can also make a claim that something is a stylized fact and have it fail in the sense that no one cares. So you can say, I've identified this important regularity, we need to pay attention to it, and everyone else can say, no, we don't, moving on. Those are sort of two ways in which stylized fact claims might fail sort of differently. So you can try to say something is a stylized fact doesn't always succeed. So that's kind of the setup. That's where the book is coming from. That's my sort of take on what these things are and how they move. And then I think that's interesting or valuable because it helps illuminate new dynamics about the histories of inequality debates around different topics that certainly sociologists, but I think also economists and people at large hopefully care about. And so the larger structure of the book looks like this. And this is tentative, and I'd love, of course, any comments or feedback you have. I open with a chapter outlining what I've just basically told you about how stylized facts work and what they do. And I move into 3 cases. The first case looks at the sort of the rediscovery of top incomes and sort of the role of knowledge infrastructures. And I'll give a little more detail about each of these after this. The second case looks at the gender wage gap, and the third looks at the racial wealth gap. So in other words, class, gender, and race, and looking at kind of one of the most iconic sort of statistical representations of each of these kinds of inequality and tracing their history over the 20th and 21st century, mostly in the US. One thing is, my editor wants me to get a new title. That's something I'm working on, give ideas. I'm also not sure the cases are in the right order. And lastly, the thing I'm really working on right now is trying to make sure that sort of folks coming to this project with really interested in the history of inequality and not so much in the science studies stuff, that it's clear what the payoffs are for them. So those are the things I'm currently working on and would love any feedback you have about. So brief overview of each chapter's argument. And again, I'm just going to give you the 1 2-minute version and then I'll wrap up. The first of the empirical chapters looks at the rise of the 1%. This is a famous graph from Piketty and Saez in their 2003 paper where they sort of note that top incomes had dramatically taken off in the 1980s, reaching levels they had not seen since the Great Depression. And they've extended this data since, and the numbers keep going up. And so this was kind of a blockbuster finding. It got sort of promoted even before the paper was out by Paul Krugman in the New York Times, et cetera. But the question I brought was sort of, why didn't we already know this? How could this be something that was surprising in 2003? And in particular, what's weird about that being surprising is that through the 1940s, lots and lots of economists and sociologists studied exactly this kind of data in exactly this kind of way. Piketty and Stylized did not invent any new method. They did not discover new data. They just went back and redid the kind of analysis that Simon Cousins and Wesley Mitchell did in the 1920s, 1950s. So what I show in the chapter is the top income research was prominent through this period, but then disappears in the 50s to 70s. And basically it's replaced with survey-based research. In the 1940s, surveys basically emerged, the current population survey, the PSID in the 60s, that make it possible to do all sorts of cool things you could not do with income tax data. What they couldn't do was show you movements in top income. Surveys are too small of samples, and they typically top code top incomes, such that the social scientists who end up focusing all their energy on these survey-based ways of knowing inequality literally stopped looking at movements in top income. They couldn't see it. They knew they were making that choice, but they didn't think it was important enough to keep track of these things, in part because they were studying in the period when there wasn't a lot of action. Top incomes weren't really moving that much. And so they kind of were like, cool, we don't care that much, we can't see it. They knew it was happening, they lost track of it, and then things started shifting and no one sort of noticed right away until folks went back and redid that work. Once they did so, of course, it becomes incredibly productive. It gets taken up in other academic conversations by people like Hacker and Pearson in political science, a bunch of sociologists, like Lisa Keister, et cetera, and then travels out into politics. It's in a big prominent Bernie Sanders speech, picked up by Occupy Wall Street, and then dramatically changes the conversation on inequality afterwards. So that's that chapter, focusing really on kind of like the role of knowledge infrastructures, mediating the relationship between what academics sort of are capable of seeing and what kinds of ways of inequality are thus capable of sort of being made public. The next chapter looks at the gender wage gap, which, and particularly focusing on the mid to late 20th century. So the gender wage gap gets taken up by feminist movements and put into iconic forms like these buttons from the 1970s, showing that women were making 59 cents on the dollar what men were making and demanding equal pay in various ways. And so what's interesting about this chapter, or the point of this chapter, is to look at sort of the tensions when academic debates and public debates don't line up very well. Because anyone who's ever sort of given a lecture about the gender wage gap knows everyone thinks it means same work, different pay. That is to say, everyone thinks that the gender wage gap is referring to people who are working in the same job, one man, one woman, women getting paid less. It's never meant that. Probably like something between 0 to 4%, depending on the measure and the time period of the gender wage gap is that. And the other 16 to 40 percentage points, depending on the year, is other stuff, mostly occupational segregation. Men and women work different jobs, even to now, and the jobs men work tend to pay better. So what happened? How did this disconnect emerge, and what sort of space did it occupy? How do we understand this kind of endless debate over the gender wage gap? And what I show in the chapter is that the gender wage gap is sort of initially pushed in the 60s and 70s by the feminist movement, and in particular is connected to a politics of desegregating the workforce. And in addition to both sort of enabling women's entry into previously male-dominated occupations, also revaluing women's work, the so-called comparable worth movement, which took the sort of gender wage gap as typically measured as kind of one of its rallying cries, right? Showing that women's work was devalued, not just that individual women in particular jobs were making less than their men counterparts in those jobs. That movement basically fails. Feminist movement goes into decline in general. The comparable worth movement loses steam. And yet the gender wage gap number itself persists, but it gets wrapped up in other narratives as the feminist movement sort of loses narrative control. And instead the conversation becomes one around women's choices, particularly around work-family conflicts and motherhood. That's both where the academic conversation goes, but also especially where the policy conversation goes, the kind of public conversation. And so here the chapter shows how like kind of the folk economics of gender inequality, shaped in part by particularly the role of the law, right? People read the number as if it's relevant to the Equal Pay Act, which it's mostly not, which leads to sort of consistent misinterpretation, even by feminist advocates who are advocating gender inequality, who misunderstand what the number represents, which of course then entails the kind of constant debunking from the right, who says, oh, the gender wage gap is just a myth. And you get this kind of back and forth endless debate, rather than kind of a more nuanced understanding that's available in the academic literature, which kind of fails to make its way in the public conversation over and over again. The last chapter looks at the racial wealth gap. And this chart from the Washington Post kind of nicely dramatizes why a group of scholars in the 1990s and 2000s decided they wanted to make the racial wealth gap a thing. That is, to make it something the public was aware of. If you look at racial income gaps, you see a stark and consistent gap where, say, Black families make about 60% of what white families make. If you look at the racial wealth gap, you see a much starker, maybe 10-to-1 difference. That also is not closing and in fact got worse in during the 2008 recession. It's a much starker one. And it also shifts the conversation from one about sort of current productivity, because we think of income in terms of human capital and skills, and shifts it to instead being one about legacies of the past discrimination, intergenerational wealth, inheritance, and so on. And so from the 1940s to 2000s, most racial inequality research emphasized income and not wealth, based on those same survey data sets that we talked about in the previous chapter. But in the 90s and 2000s, there was kind of growing interest among academics about the extent of the racial wealth gap. And this turned into a concerted effort of a relatively small group of what I'm going to call fact entrepreneurs. That is people who are trying to like make a fact happen. Mostly Black academics in economics and sociology who got some support from the Ford Foundation to actually like do messaging around this particular number, to produce reports and op-ed pieces and get journalists involved and so on. Specifically to move the racial inequality conversation away from ones around skills and human capital and towards ones around structural racism, baby bonds, and reparations, which has succeeded. Those of you may remember the Blockbuster 2014 article, The Case for Reparations by Ta-Nehisi Coates. He opens with statistics about the racial wealth gap. And you see it all over the conversation around structural racism inspired by Black Lives Matter in a way you wouldn't have 10, 20, 30, or 40 years earlier. So that's the kind of structure of the book. And I'm hoping the book will be useful to people who are thinking about both the role of social scientists and their influence on policymaking, but also folks who are interested in kind of the politics of inequality more broadly, right? And that's where I'll stop. Thank you all so much. Oh, and for Mark, the current title is Unequal Knowledge, the Stylized Facts of Inequality.
Great, Dan. Thank you so much for sharing this work with us. So I have a question about simply the changing terrain on which inequality knowledge moves to inequality politics through stylized facts. And that is to say, as we move from the 20th century into the 21st century, as we move from a world in which, you know, maybe getting your interest represented in a segment of 60 minutes is something different from having a tweet go viral. And the ways in which simply in the current media environment and with seemingly so much more savvy about how to create facts that can go viral in a media environment with 8,000 different platforms rather than 3 networks and 4 credible magazines that smart and serious people read. How, I mean, in some cases, how do you control for that shifting landscape? Or would you argue, in fact, that it has always been the kind of thing where fact entrepreneurs have understood how to introduce stylized facts into the prominent policymaking discourse?
I think it's a great question. And one of the things I thought about doing with the conclusion is sort of getting into some of the sort of like emergence of data journalism and the kind of rise of these this different relationship between the media and particularly quantitative social science. Like Raj Chetty has a piece in the New York Times like every 2 seconds, right? In addition to being able to go viral on Twitter and things like that. So there isn't both the traditional media, if it even can call it that, because New York Times is mostly a website at this point, but like even they have a different relationship to these kind of things than they used to. And then of course the other things we were talking about make sense as well, are useful as well. I think the different cases provide some leverage on this because they have somewhat different trajectories. So like the gender wage gap, there's not really a clear entrepreneur. Like the feminist movement picks up and runs with it, but it's sort of like, it doesn't have the same kind of specific group of academics pushing a kind of story with the racial wealth gap. And I think that partly accounts for some of the confusion because it gets picked up, but it's always somewhat of a question as to what it actually means. And it has a different kind of politics to it. But it does get picked up by social movement very explicitly in an earlier media environment. It's well established by the 1980s, 1990s. So it's clearly like kind of old media story. The Piketty and Saez story is somewhat transitional, but one of the key routes seems to be like New York Times and Paul Krugman's op-ed columns and things like this and New York Times Magazine pieces, which is part of what helps it become more than just a kind of isolated QJE article and makes it kind of a bigger public fact. And then it gets picked up by social movements. Whereas, right, the racial wealth gap, the folks doing that messaging were doing it in 2007, 2012, and yeah, Twitter is there, right? And that makes a big difference. And like you see, like Ben & Jerry's puts together a fact sheet on structural racism in response to Black Lives Matter 1, and like it's the first fact they list and things like this. So I think it's a really important question. I think one thing that I've had the hardest trouble with over the course of this project is sort of incorporating a more satisfactory analysis of the media and its role and how that changes over time. because clearly they're a key mediating force for at least some of this. Like one of the routes of policymaking influence is presumably sort of like direct informing of policy makers. But for most of these kinds of more diffuse kind of routes of influencing, it goes through like media and social movements together. And so just to say, I think it's a great question. I think the cases have somewhat different stories there. I do think that some of these actors really are savvy though, and are thinking exactly these terms and producing sound bites and hiring PR firms and all this stuff in this environment. I think that's maybe an exception. I think the more common route, especially in the 20th century, was more like facts kind of traveling somewhat unbeknownst to their creators sort of, energy. The last thing I'll say is one thing about the Petty and Sias story that also is really relevant is they don't just write the one paper. They create a whole website, they post an Excel spreadsheet that's like becomes like the authoritative way to get this data for a decade. And they eventually create this thing called the World Inequality Database. And for a long time, even like the CBO, the Congressional Budget Office, like points to their Excel spreadsheet in the late 2000s because that's like the most authoritative data set everyone's got of this stuff. And so, there is something about being able to make it public in a certain way that is productive, that requires some sustained infrastructural work that some of them engage in this really useful way. So thanks.
Wonderful. Thank you.